My wife made fun of my height and left me for a taller man. "I need a real man, not half of one," she yelled. When she came back to get her things, she found a red note on the table. She read it and her face went pale. I had done something she never saw coming. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. I'm Charles, and at 60 years old, I thought I knew what betrayal felt like. I was wrong. 35 years. That's how long Elisa and I had been married when she decided I wasn't man enough for her anymore. 35 years of building a life together, of supporting each other through everything life threw at us, of believing we were partners in the truest sense. All of that crumbled in a single afternoon when she packed her bags and walked out with words that still echo in my mind like a curse. "I need a real man, not half of one." The venom in her voice when she said it made my chest tighten. We were standing in our kitchen, the same kitchen where we'd shared thousands of meals, where she used to laugh at my terrible jokes, where she once told me height didn't matter because love was bigger than any physical trait. That woman felt like a stranger now. "Charles, look at yourself," she continued, her arms crossed, eyes cold as winter. "You're 5'6". You've always been 5'6", but somehow I convinced myself it didn't matter. Well, I'm done pretending." I stood there in silence, watching the woman I'd loved for more than half my life tear me apart with surgical precision. My hands trembled slightly as I gripped the counter behind me, needing something solid to hold onto as my world shifted beneath my feet. "You walk into a room and disappear," she said, her voice gaining momentum like she'd been rehearsing this speech. "When we're out together, people look right through you. Do you know how embarrassing that is for me? Do you know what it's like being married to someone who has to look up at everyone?" Each word felt like a physical blow. This wasn't the first time she'd made comments about my height, but they'd been getting worse over the past few months. Little jabs disguised as jokes, comments about how cute it was that she could reach things I couldn't, suggestions that maybe I should wear shoes with thicker soles. I'd laughed them off, thinking they were harmless teasing between spouses who'd been together forever. I was wrong about that too. "Trevor makes me feel like a woman should feel," she continued, and my stomach dropped. Trevor. I knew that name. He was the contractor who'd been working on our neighbor's renovation project for the past 3 months. Tall, broad-shouldered, probably in his early 40s. I'd seen Elisa talking to him over the fence a few times, but I thought she was just being neighborly. "Trevor?" I managed to say, my voice coming out smaller than I intended. "You're leaving me for the contractor?" She smiled then, and it was the cruelest expression I'd ever seen on her face. "He's 6'3", Charles. He makes me feel protected, desired. When I'm with him, I remember what it feels like to be with a real man." The kitchen seemed to spin around me. I reached for one of the wooden chairs at our breakfast table, the one where we used to sit together on Sunday mornings reading different sections of the newspaper, occasionally sharing interesting articles or funny comics. Those simple, peaceful moments felt like they'd happened in another lifetime. "How long?" I asked. "Does it matter?" "It matters to me." She sighed like I was being unreasonable. 3 weeks. And before you ask, yes, it's serious. He's asked me to move in with him. 3 weeks. While I'd been working late at the accounting firm, staying extra hours to finish client reports, she'd been with him. While I'd been stopping at the grocery store on my way home, picking up her favorite tea and the special crackers she liked, she'd been planning her escape from our marriage. "I've already talked to a lawyer," she said, pulling me back to the devastating present. "I'll get half of everything, of course. The house, your retirement account, all of it. That should be enough to start fresh with someone who actually makes me happy." I nodded slowly, not trusting myself to speak. What could I say? That I loved her? That we could work through this? The look in her eyes told me she'd already moved on emotionally. I was just paperwork to be processed now. She walked upstairs to pack, and I stood alone in that kitchen listening to her footsteps above me, drawers opening and closing, the sound of hangers scraping against the closet rod. Each sound felt like another nail in the coffin of our marriage. When she came back down 30 minutes later with 2 large suitcases, she paused at the front door. For a moment I thought she might say something kind, something that acknowledged the life we'd built together. Instead, she looked at me with something close to pity. "I should have done this years ago," she said. "I wasted too much time trying to convince myself that size doesn't matter. It does, Charles, in every way that counts." The door closed behind her with a quiet click, and I was alone. I walked to the living room window and watched her load her suitcases into Trevor's massive pickup truck. Even from a distance, I could see how small she looked next to him, how her head barely reached his shoulder. She was smiling, animated, gesturing with her hands as she talked. I hadn't seen her that excited about anything in years. That night I sat in my recliner, our recliner, staring at the empty spot on the couch where she used to curl up with her book every evening. The silence was deafening. For 35 years, this house had been filled with conversation, laughter, the comfortable sounds of two people sharing space. Now it felt like a museum of memories I wasn't sure I wanted to keep. But as I sat there in the darkness, something strange began to happen. Underneath the crushing pain and humiliation, I felt something else stirring. Something I hadn't experienced in a very long time. It took me a while to recognize what it was. It was relief. And that realization scared me more than anything else that had happened that day. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a courier who looked apologetic as he handed me the thick envelope. I'd been expecting them, but seeing my name typed in formal legal language still felt like a punch to the gut. Charles Andrew Morrison versus Elisa Catherine Morrison. 35 years reduced to a court case number, but the legal documents were just the beginning of my humiliation. Word travels fast in our neighborhood, especially when it involves someone like Trevor who'd been working on houses throughout our subdivision. Within a week, I started noticing the stares, the whispered conversations that stopped when I approached, the way some neighbors suddenly found urgent tasks inside their homes when they saw me getting my mail. It was Janet Holloway from 3 houses down who finally told me what Elisa had been saying. "Charles, honey," Janet said, cornering me at the mailbox on Thursday afternoon. "I don't normally get involved in other people's business, but I thought you should know what's being said about you." My stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" Janet glanced around nervously, as if Elisa might materialize from behind a tree. "She's been telling everyone that you were inadequate as a husband. She's saying that's why she had to find someone else, that you couldn't satisfy her needs as a woman." The blood drained from my face. "She said that?" "To multiple people, Charles. At the grocery store, at the bank, even to my book club when she ran into us at the coffee shop. She's painting a very specific picture of your marriage, and it's not flattering." I felt my hands clench into fists at my sides. The physical betrayal had been devastating enough, but this systematic destruction of my reputation felt even more cruel. Elisa wasn't content with just leaving me. She was determined to humiliate me publicly. "She also mentioned something about your size," Janet continued, her voice dropping to an uncomfortable whisper. "She said that was part of the problem. That she'd been living a lie for decades, pretending she didn't mind being married to someone so much smaller than her." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of every conversation I'd have to endure, every knowing look, every whispered comment behind my back. In a small community like ours, reputation mattered. Elisa knew exactly what she was doing. "I'm sorry, Charles. I just thought you should know what you're dealing with." That evening, I called my brother David in Chicago. We hadn't spoken in months, but I needed to hear a familiar voice, someone who knew me before all this happened. "She's telling people what?" David's voice rose an octave through the phone. "Charles, that's character assassination. You can't just let her destroy your reputation like that." "What am I supposed to do? Go door to door defending myself? Take out an ad in the local paper explaining my marital problems?" "You could start by fighting back. You're letting her control the narrative completely." I walked to my kitchen window, looking out at the house where Trevor and Elisa were now living together. The lights were on, and I could see shadows moving behind the curtains. She'd moved on so completely, so quickly, while I was still trying to process the destruction of everything I'd thought was stable in my life. "David, there's something else," I said, my voice dropping. "Something I never told Elisa, something she doesn't know about." "What are you talking about?" I took a deep breath, remembering the day 7 years ago when the lawyer had called about Uncle Raymond's will. Uncle Raymond had been my father's older brother, a man who'd moved to Montana in the 1970s and essentially disappeared from family gatherings. We'd exchanged Christmas cards, but that was about the extent of our relationship. Remember Uncle Raymond, Dad's brother? The hermit who lived in Montana. What about him? When he died 7 years ago, he left me everything. His ranch, his investments, mineral rights on the land. The lawyer said it was worth about $2.7 million. Silence stretched across the phone line. Finally David spoke, his voice stunned. 2.7 million? Charles, why didn't you ever tell anyone? Because I didn't want it to change anything. Elisa and I were happy, or at least I thought we were. I figured I'd tell her eventually, maybe when we retired. The money was just sitting there, invested, growing. I never touched it. Please tell me it's not in joint accounts. No, it's all in my name only. Uncle Raymond's will was very specific about that. Everything had to remain in the beneficiary's sole name for tax purposes. David let out a low whistle. So Elisa has no idea she just walked away from millions? None. She thinks she's getting half of my savings account, half the house, half my pension. She has no clue about the Montana properties or the investment portfolio. Charles, this changes everything. She can't claim what she doesn't know exists. That night I sat down at my computer and began typing. Not an angry letter, not an emotional plea. Instead, I crafted something much more powerful. A simple factual statement that would shatter Elisa's world just as completely as she'd shattered mine. The note was brief, direct, and devastating in its simplicity. I printed it on plain white paper, folded it carefully, and placed it on the kitchen table where she'd be sure to see it when she came to collect the rest of her belongings. As I climbed the stairs to bed that night, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks, a sense of control returning to my life. Elisa thought she held all the cards, thought she'd planned the perfect escape from our marriage. She had no idea that the man she dismissed as inadequate, the husband she'd publicly humiliated as being not enough, had been quietly sitting on a fortune that would have secured both of our futures. But that was when she still deserved to know. Now she was about to learn what real consequences looked like. I folded the note one more time, smoothed the edges, and placed it exactly where she'd find it. Tomorrow, when she came for her grandmother's china and the photo albums she'd forgotten in her rush to start her new life, she'd discover that some secrets are more valuable than others, and some mistakes can't be undone. Elisa came back on Saturday morning, just as I'd expected she would. I watched from my upstairs bedroom window as Trevor's truck pulled into our driveway, the engine rumbling like some mechanical beast marking its territory. She stepped out wearing clothes I'd never seen before. A flowing red dress that made her look younger, more vibrant than she'd appeared in years. Trevor stayed in the truck, engine running, clearly expecting this to be a quick retrieval mission. She still had her key, of course. I heard the front door open, heard her heels clicking against the hardwood floors we'd installed together 15 years ago during that ambitious weekend renovation project. Back then we'd laughed as we struggled with the nail gun, celebrated each completed row with cheap wine and take-out pizza. The memory felt like it belonged to different people. From my position at the top of the stairs, I could hear her moving through the house with the efficiency of someone following a mental checklist. Living room first, properly collecting the decorative items she'd inherited from her mother. Then the dining room for her grandmother's china set, the one she'd insisted on using for every holiday dinner, despite my protest that it was too valuable for regular use. I knew the exact moment she found the note. The sounds stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. Then came the sharp intake of breath, followed by the rustle of paper being unfolded. The note was simple, written in my neat accountant's handwriting on crisp white stationery. Elisa, you said I was half a man who could never provide for you the way a real man could. You told our neighbors I was inadequate in every way that mattered. You painted me as a failure who held you back from the life you deserved. You were wrong about many things, but you were especially wrong about my ability to provide. 7 years ago, my Uncle Raymond passed away and left me his entire estate in Montana. The ranch spans 8,000 acres, with mineral rights included. The property is currently valued at $1.9 million. His investment portfolio, which I've been managing conservatively, is worth an additional $800,000. There are also oil leases on the northern portion of the land that generate approximately $40,000 annually in passive income. You never knew about this inheritance because I wanted our marriage to be about love, not money. I planned to tell you when we retired, thinking we'd spend our golden years traveling and enjoying the security together. Instead, you chose to leave me for a man you believe can offer you more than I ever could. Since you've made it clear that material provision is what matters most to you, I thought you should know exactly what you walked away from. The entire inheritance remains solely in my name, as specified in Uncle Raymond's will for tax purposes. Montana is not a community property state, and inherited assets received during marriage remain separate property unless explicitly commingled. You will receive exactly what you knew about when you left. Half of our joint savings, $4,200. Half the value of this house, approximately $67,000. And half of my pension, valued at roughly $120,000. The $2.7 million inheritance you never knew existed will remain mine alone. I hope Trevor's 6'3" frame provides the security you were looking for. Charles. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then I heard something I'd never heard from Elisa in 35 years of marriage. A sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob, raw and broken. Paper crumpled. Footsteps rushed toward the kitchen. I heard cabinet doors slamming open, the sound of her searching through drawers frantically. She was looking for something. Anything that might contradict what she'd just read. No, 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 no. Her voice drifted up the stairs, barely a whisper but carrying the weight of someone watching their entire world collapse. More footsteps, faster now, heading toward the home office where I kept important papers. I heard her rifling through files, probably looking for bank statements or legal documents that might prove the note was some kind of cruel joke. But she wouldn't find anything. I'd been meticulous about keeping Uncle Raymond's inheritance completely separate from our joint finances. The front door slammed. Through my bedroom window, I watched her stumble toward Trevor's truck, the red note clutched in her trembling hand. Even from a distance, I could see that her face had gone pale. All the confidence and satisfaction from earlier completely drained away. Trevor rolled down his window as she approached, probably expecting to hear about what valuable items she'd recovered. Instead, Elisa thrust the note toward him, her mouth moving rapidly as she explained what she'd just discovered. I watched his expression change from casual interest to confusion to something that looked like anger. He grabbed the note from her hands, reading it himself. Even from my upstairs window, I could see the exact moment the full implications hit him. His face darkened, and he said something sharp that made Elisa step back from the truck. Trevor crumpled the note and threw it at her feet. Then he said something else, something that made her shoulders shake. She reached for the truck door handle, but he shifted into reverse, backing out of the driveway while she was still standing beside the vehicle. I watched Elisa stand in our driveway alone, as Trevor's truck disappeared around the corner. She picked up the crumpled note, smoothed it out with shaking hands, and read it again as if the words might have changed. They hadn't. She looked up at the house then, scanning the windows until her eyes found mine. Even from that distance, I could see the desperation in her face, the realization of what she'd lost hitting her with full force. She raised one hand, a tentative wave, a gesture that might have been an attempt at reconciliation. I stepped back from the window. 30 minutes later, my phone began ringing. Elisa's number appeared on the screen again and again. I let every call go to voicemail. After the 10th attempt, I turned the phone off entirely. That evening, I opened a bottle of wine. Not the cheap stuff Elisa and I usually shared, but an expensive Bordeaux I'd been saving for a special occasion. I sat in my leather chair, the one she'd always complained was too small for the living room, and raised a glass to the empty house. For the first time in months, I felt something approaching peace. The next morning brought a new reality. I called my lawyer, James Patterson, a man I'd known since college who specialized in family law. After I explained the situation, including the details of Uncle Raymond's inheritance, he was quiet for a long moment. "Charles," he finally said, his voice carefully controlled, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Did Elisa know about this inheritance at any point during your marriage?" "Never. I kept it completely separate, exactly as Uncle Raymond's will specified." "And you never discussed it, never mentioned plans for the money, never used it for joint expenses?" "Nothing. As far as she knew, it didn't exist." James let out a slow breath. "Then she has no claim to it whatsoever. Inherited assets that remain separate property don't become part of the marital estate in this state." You're going to walk away from this divorce with significantly more than she ever imagined." I stared out my office window, watching the neighborhood where Elisa had spent weeks destroying my reputation. Soon these same neighbors would learn a very different version of our story. Not because I planned to gossip or retaliate, but because truth has a way of surfacing. "There's something else," I told James. "I want to make some changes to my will, and I want to establish a trust. It's time I stopped letting other people underestimate what I'm capable of." As I hung up the phone, I realized that Elisa's greatest mistake wasn't leaving me for another man. It was assuming that the man she'd lived with for 35 years was exactly who she thought he was. She was about to learn how wrong she'd been about that, too. The call started that same evening and didn't stop for 3 days. Elisa's number appeared on my phone so frequently that I eventually blocked it, but she found other ways to reach me. She called from Trevor's phone, from numbers I didn't recognize, even from the landline at our local coffee shop. Each voicemail more desperate than the last. "Charles, please, we need to talk. I made a terrible mistake." "Charles, pick up the phone. We can work this out." "Charles, I'm sorry about what I said. I was confused. I didn't mean any of it." I deleted them all without listening to the end. It was my neighbor Janet who told me what was really happening across the street at Trevor's house. She knocked on my door Tuesday evening, her face a mixture of concern and poorly concealed curiosity. "Charles, honey, I hope you don't mind me asking, but is Alexa okay? There's been quite a lot of drama over at Trevor's place the last few days." I invited her in for coffee, genuinely curious about what she'd observed. Janet had always been the neighborhood's unofficial information network, and her front window provided a perfect view of Trevor's property. "Sunday night there was a lot of shouting," she said, settling into the kitchen chair where Elisa used to sit for our morning conversations. "Trevor was outside on his front porch yelling at someone on the phone. I couldn't make out all the words, but I definitely heard him say something about being lied to and gold digging." I poured Janet's coffee, keeping my expression carefully neutral. "That sounds unpleasant." Monday morning I saw Elisa carrying suitcases out to her car. She looked like she'd been crying, but the strange thing is she didn't drive away. She just sat in her car in his driveway for hours, like she was waiting for something. The picture Janet painted became clearer as she continued. Trevor had apparently discovered that his new girlfriend wasn't the financially secure divorcee she'd implied she would be. When Elisa showed him my note explaining that she'd just walked away from millions of dollars to be with him, Trevor's enthusiasm for their relationship had evaporated instantly. "He told her she was an idiot," Janet continued, lowering her voice as if Trevor might somehow overhear. "I was watering my front garden when I heard him say, 'You left a millionaire for me. Lady, I can barely afford my truck payments. What exactly did you think I was going to do for you?'" According to Janet, Trevor had made his intentions clear from the beginning. He'd been attracted to Elisa partly because she seemed financially stable, a woman who could contribute equally to a relationship. The idea of supporting someone else, especially someone who'd made such a catastrophically poor decision, held no appeal for him. "She's been staying at that motel on Highway 12, Janet said. "I saw her car there yesterday when I drove past. The Pineview Inn, you know the one." I knew it. A rundown establishment that charged by the week, the kind of place people stayed when they had nowhere else to go. The image of Elisa, who'd always insisted on the finest hotels during our vacations, living in that depressing environment, struck me as an appropriate justice. Wednesday brought a new development. I was working in my home office when I heard a car door slam in my driveway. Through the window I saw Elisa's sedan parked behind my car, effectively blocking my exit. She stood on my front porch, finger pressed against the doorbell, the sound echoing through my house in insistent, desperate bursts. I didn't answer. "Charles, I know you're in there," she called out. "Your car is here, and I can see the office light on. Please, just give me 5 minutes. 5 minutes to explain." The doorbell continued its assault on my nerves. After 10 minutes, she moved to knocking, each rap against the wooden door sharp and demanding. I put on my headphones and turned up the music, but I could still feel the vibration of her fists against the frame. An hour later, the noise stopped. I looked out to see her sitting on my front steps, head in her hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Part of me, the part that had loved her for 35 years, wanted to open that door and comfort her. But a larger part, The part that remembered her cruel words about my height and adequacy kept me firmly planted in my chair. She sat there until the sun went down, occasionally looking up at the windows hopefully, as if I might change my mind and invite her in. When the streetlights came on, she finally returned to her car and drove away. Thursday brought a different approach. My doorbell rang at 8 in the morning, but instead of Elisa's voice, I heard a man's baritone calling my name. "Mr. Morrison, my name is Robert Chen. I'm an attorney representing your wife. She's asked me to facilitate a conversation between you two." I opened the door to find a well-dressed man in his 40s holding a briefcase and wearing an expression of professional patience. Behind him, sitting in a black sedan with tinted windows, I could just make out Elisa's silhouette. "I'm not interested in any conversations," I told him. Mrs. Morrison made her feelings about our marriage very clear when she left. The divorce proceedings can continue through proper legal channels. "Mr. Morrison, I understand there may have been some misunderstandings about marital assets. Perhaps we could discuss an arrangement that would be more equitable for both parties." The word equitable almost made me laugh. Elisa had hired a lawyer to try to get her hands on Uncle Raymond's inheritance. She still believed she could manipulate her way back into wealth, even after destroying our marriage and humiliating me publicly. "There are no marital assets to discuss beyond what was already disclosed," I said calmly. "Anything else Mrs. Morrison believes exists is mistaken information." Robert Chen glanced back toward the sedan, then returned his attention to me. "Mr. Morrison, your wife is prepared to withdraw her statements about your marriage. She's willing to publicly apologize for any damage to your reputation and work toward reconciliation." "For a percentage of the inheritance?" His slight pause told me everything I needed to know. "She's willing to discuss terms that would be fair to both parties." I looked past him toward the sedan where Elisa waited. Even through the tinted glass, I could feel her desperation radiating outward like heat from a fire. She'd sent a lawyer to negotiate her way back into my life and my bank account, believing that money could undo the damage she'd caused. "Please tell Mrs. Morrison that our marriage ended when she chose to leave. There are no terms to discuss, no reconciliation to pursue, and no assets to divide beyond what she was already aware of. Good day, Mr. Chen." I closed the door and watched through my front window as the lawyer returned to the sedan. I could see Elisa's agitated gestures as he delivered my message, could practically feel her frustration and disbelief that her plan had failed. The sedan pulled away, but I knew this wasn't over. Elisa had never been good at accepting defeat, and the thought of all that money slipping through her fingers would drive her to increasingly desperate measures. That evening, I called my lawyer James to update him on the day's events. "She hired Robert Chen?" James sounded impressed despite himself. "He's not cheap. If she's spending that kind of money on legal representation, she must be convinced there's a significant payout waiting for her." "Can she cause any real problems?" "Not legally. The inheritance is ironclad as separate property. But Charles, desperate people do unpredictable things. You might want to consider some additional security measures." As I hung up the phone, I realized that Elisa's desperation was about more than just money. She'd built her entire identity around being the woman who'd finally found someone better than her inadequate husband. Now she faced the reality that she'd given up millions of dollars for a man who'd rejected her the moment he realized she couldn't contribute financially to their relationship. She wasn't just losing money. She was losing the story she'd told herself about who she was and what she deserved. And people in that position, I was beginning to understand, were capable of almost anything. 2 weeks after the lawyer's visit, I made a decision that would have shocked the man I'd been just months before. I called a realtor and put our house on the market. Standing in the living room where Elisa and I had hosted countless dinner parties, where we'd decorated Christmas trees and celebrated anniversaries, I felt nothing but relief. This house had become a monument to a life that no longer existed, filled with memories of a woman who'd systematically destroyed my self-worth before abandoning me entirely. The realtor, a sharp woman named Patricia Wells, walked through each room with professional efficiency, making notes about staging and potential selling points. When she quoted the expected market value, $168,000, I realized that Elisa's share would amount to barely $84,000. A sum that had probably seemed significant to her when she planned her escape was now laughably small compared to what she'd unknowingly abandoned. "The market's strong right now," Patricia said, standing in the kitchen where I'd received that devastating news about Trevor. "With some minor updates and proper staging, we could have offers within a week." I signed the listing agreement that afternoon. For the first time since Elisa's departure, I felt truly free. That same week I did something else that would have been unthinkable during my marriage. I hired a personal trainer. At 60 years old, I'd convinced myself that physical improvement was pointless, that my short stature meant I'd never be impressive or commanding. Elisa's constant comments about my size had reinforced those beliefs until I'd stopped seeing any potential in my own body. Marcus Thompson was a former Marine who ran a small gym downtown, specializing in older clients who wanted to reclaim their strength. When I explained my goals, not to become a bodybuilder but to feel confident in my own skin again, he nodded with understanding. "Height's got nothing to do with strength," he said during our first session, watching me struggle with weights that had felt impossible just minutes before. "Some of the toughest men I've known were compact, efficient, less body to maintain, lower center of gravity. You've got advantages you've never thought about." Within a month I could see changes. Not dramatic transformation, but something more subtle and powerful. The way I carried myself. My shoulders stayed back, my stride became more confident. When I caught my reflection in store windows, I saw a man who looked purposeful rather than apologetic. The house sold in 6 days, exactly as Patricia had predicted. Multiple offers came in, and I accepted one for $10,000 above asking price. As I signed the final paperwork, I felt the last chain to my old life break away. But Elisa wasn't finished with me yet. She'd apparently been watching the house, waiting for signs of activity. The morning the sold sign went up in our front yard, my phone started ringing again. This time she didn't bother with intermediaries or lawyers. Her voice came through my voicemail, raw and desperate. "Charles, you can't sell our house. That's our life together you're throwing away. Please call me back. We need to talk about this like adults." The next message came 2 hours later, angrier now. "You're being vindictive, Charles. This isn't about money. It's about destroying everything we built together. How can you be so cruel?" By evening, the tone had shifted to pleading. "Charles, I'm begging you. I made a mistake. A terrible, terrible mistake. But we can fix this. We can go to counseling, work through our problems. Don't throw away 35 years over one stupid decision." I saved every voicemail but didn't respond to any of them. 3 days before my move to a downtown condominium I'd purchased outright with cash, Elisa appeared at my front door one final time. But this wasn't the confident woman who'd left me for Trevor, or even the desperate woman who'd hired lawyers to negotiate her return. This was someone I barely recognized. She'd lost weight enough that her clothes hung loosely on her frame. Her hair, always perfectly styled during our marriage, showed gray roots she'd apparently stopped bothering to touch up. Dark circles under her eyes suggested she hadn't been sleeping well. "Charles," she said when I opened the door, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, just let me come in for 5 minutes. 5 minutes to explain everything." Against my better judgment, I stepped aside and allowed her into what had been our home. She looked around the empty rooms. I'd donated most of our furniture to charity rather than taking it to my new place, with an expression of profound loss. "I've been thinking about what you said in your note," she began, settling carefully onto one of the few remaining chairs, "about wanting our marriage to be about love, not money. You were right. I lost sight of what mattered." I remained standing, arms crossed, maintaining physical and emotional distance. "What you lost sight of, Elisa, was basic human decency. You didn't just leave me. You tried to destroy my reputation on your way out." She winced, looking down at her hands. "I was angry. I felt trapped, like I'd wasted years of my life. But I was wrong about you, Charles. I was wrong about everything. You were wrong about a lot of things, but you weren't wrong about one thing. You did waste years of your life. You wasted them being married to someone you clearly despised." "I didn't despise you," she said quickly. I don't know how to explain it. I felt invisible next to you. When we went out together, people would look right through us. I started to blame you for that, like it was your fault that we weren't an impressive couple. The honesty was surprising, but it came too late. So you decided to find someone who made you feel impressive. Trevor made me feel noticed, she admitted. When I was with him, people stared. Other women looked jealous. For the first time in years, I felt like I was someone worth looking at. And how did that work out for you? Her composure cracked then. He threw me out the same day I showed him your note. Said he wasn't interested in supporting someone else's financial mistakes. He called me pathetic, Charles. Said I was an idiot for leaving a millionaire for a contractor with debt problems. The vindication felt hollow. I'd spent weeks imagining this moment, when Elisa would realize the full scope of her error. But seeing her broken didn't bring the satisfaction I'd expected. I'm staying at the Pineview Inn, she continued, tears starting to fall. Do you know what it's like there, Charles? The walls are thin, the heat barely works, and I can hear everything that happens in the rooms next to mine. I lie awake at night listening to other people's problems and wondering how I destroyed my entire life in 3 weeks. You destroyed your life the moment you decided I wasn't enough for you. But I could come back, she said desperately. We could start over. I know about the inheritance now, so there wouldn't be any more secrets between us. We could travel, buy a nice house somewhere, live the life we always talked about. I stared at her, amazed by the audacity of her proposal. Even now, sitting in the ruins of our marriage, she believed money could fix what she'd broken. Elisa, I said quietly, do you understand what you're asking me? You want me to forgive you for abandoning me, humiliating me, and attempting to destroy my reputation, all because you now realize I have money you want access to. It's not about the money, she protested, but we both knew she was lying. If I were still the man you thought I was, the inadequate husband with modest savings and a small pension, would you be here right now asking for reconciliation? Her silence answered the question. I walked to the front door and opened it. Goodbye, Elisa. I hope you find whatever it is you're really looking for. She sat in that chair for another few minutes, crying quietly, before finally gathering herself and walking toward the door. At the threshold, she turned back one last time. Charles, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know that losing you was the biggest mistake of my life. No, I said gently. Your biggest mistake was never recognizing what you had in the first place. After she left, I stood in my empty house and realized something profound had shifted inside me. I no longer felt angry or hurt or vindictive. I felt free. Free from her expectations, her criticisms, her need for me to be someone I wasn't. For the first time in decades, I was excited about my future. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I stood on the deck of my new home overlooking Lake Tahoe, watching the morning sun paint the water gold. The mountain air filled my lungs as I sipped coffee from a mug I'd chosen myself, in a house I'd bought with my own money, surrounded by silence that felt like peace rather than loneliness. The lake house had been an impulse purchase, something the old Charles would never have considered. But the new Charles, the man who discovered he was worth nearly $3 million, had walked through the property once and known it was where he belonged. Not because it was expensive or impressive, but because it felt like home in a way our suburban house never had. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, my trainer, confirming our afternoon session. At 60 years old, I was in the best shape of my adult life. Not because I was trying to prove anything to Elisa or anyone else, but because I'd finally learned to invest in myself. The man who stared back at me from mirrors now stood straight, moved with confidence, and looked comfortable in his own skin regardless of his height. The divorce settlement had been exactly what I'd outlined in that red note. Elisa received her half of the house sale, $84,000, plus her portion of our joint savings and my pension. In total, she walked away with just under $200,000, a respectable sum for starting over, but a fraction of what she'd given up when she chose Trevor's height over my devotion. I'd heard through neighborhood gossip that she'd moved to Phoenix, supposedly to be closer to a sister she'd barely spoken to in years. The Pineview Inn had been a temporary stop before she found a small apartment and took a job at a hotel reception desk. For a woman who'd never worked outside our home during our marriage, the adjustment had apparently been difficult. I felt no satisfaction in her struggles, but I felt no guilt either. She'd made her choices with clear eyes and cruel words. The consequences were hers to bear. My own transformation had surprised everyone who knew me, including myself. The inheritance from Uncle Raymond had done more than secure my financial future. It had given me permission to become the man I'd always been underneath the layers of self-doubt and accommodation. I'd started traveling, something Elisa had always claimed to want, but somehow never found time for when the opportunity arose. Last month, I'd spent 2 weeks in Ireland, walking through countryside that looked like paintings and talking with locals who cared nothing about my height or marital status. They saw me as an interesting American with good stories and a willingness to buy rounds at the pub. Before that, I'd taken a photography workshop in Santa Fe, discovering I had an eye for capturing landscapes. My instructor, a woman named Sarah, who was exactly my height and radiated the kind of confidence I was still learning, had complimented my work without qualification or surprise. When I mentioned I'd never considered myself artistic, she'd looked genuinely puzzled. "Why not?" she'd asked. "You see things differently than the tall photographers in class. Your perspective is unique, more intimate. That's valuable." It was the first time in years anyone had suggested my physical stature might be an advantage rather than a limitation. I'd also reconnected with my brother David, who'd driven out from Chicago to see my new place. He'd walked through the lake house with undisguised amazement, not at the luxury but at the transformation he saw in me. "I was worried about you after Elisa left," he'd admitted over dinner on my deck. "I thought you might fall apart completely. Instead, you're thriving in a way I've never seen before." "I think I was falling apart for years," I'd replied. "Losing Elisa just forced me to put myself back together properly this time." The most surprising development had been romantic. I wasn't looking for love, hadn't even considered dating after 35 years of marriage, but somehow it found me anyway. Her name was Catherine, a widowed professor of literature who'd moved to the lake area to write the novel she'd always planned but never started. We'd met at a bookstore coffee shop where I'd become a regular, and our conversations had gradually evolved from casual chats about books to long discussions about life, loss, and unexpected second chances. Catherine was 58, graceful without being delicate, and possessed the kind of intelligence that made every conversation feel like a discovery. She was also 5'4", which meant we looked directly into each other's eyes when we talked. After months of connection, she'd mentioned casually that she appreciated not having to crane her neck to kiss someone. "I dated a man who was 6'2" once," she'd said. "Lovely person, but I got a crick in my neck every time we were affectionate. Physical compatibility matters more than people admit." We weren't rushing into anything serious. Both of us had learned the value of taking time to truly know someone, but I was rediscovering what it felt like to be appreciated for exactly who I was. The legal proceedings had wrapped up cleanly, with no last-minute attempts by Elisa to claim additional assets. Her lawyer had apparently advised her that pursuing Uncle Raymond's inheritance would be expensive and futile, given the clear documentation of its status as separate property. She'd signed the final papers without comment, accepting her portion of our shared life and walking away. I'd kept one item from our marriage, a photograph of us from our honeymoon in Napa Valley, both of us young and genuinely happy. Not because I missed those days, but because they reminded me that I was capable of love and joy, even when I'd forgotten how to access those feelings. That afternoon, as I prepared to drive into town for my training session with Marcus, my phone rang. David's name appeared on the screen, and I answered with the easy warmth that had returned to my voice over these months of transformation. "Charles, I have some news," he said without preamble. "Elisa called me yesterday." My stomach tightened slightly, but not with the old anxiety. "What did she want?" "She wanted to know if you were seeing anyone. Apparently someone she knows in Phoenix mentioned seeing photos on social media of you with a woman at some bookstore event." I smiled, remembering the reading Catherine and I had attended last week, where a local photographer had captured candid shots of the audience. We'd been sitting close together, her hand resting naturally on my arm, both of us genuinely engaged with the author's presentation. If someone had posted those photos online, they would have shown two people comfortable with each other in a way that was unmistakable. "What did you tell her?" "I told her the truth. that you seemed happier than I'd seen you in decades, and that whoever you were spending time with was clearly good for you. How did she react? David was quiet for a moment. She cried, Charles. She said she'd been hoping you were miserable without her, that you'd realize you needed her back. Finding out you'd moved on completely was apparently harder than she'd expected. I felt a brief flicker of something that might have been sympathy, but it passed quickly. She had her chance to be part of my happiness, David. She chose to try to destroy it instead. I know. I just thought you should be prepared in case she tries to contact you again. She won't, I said with certainty. Elisa only fights battles she thinks she can win. She's lost this one. After I hung up, I stood on my deck one more time, looking out at the lake that reflected the mountains and sky in perfect clarity. At 60 years old, I'd discovered something remarkable. The life I'd always been meant to live had been waiting for me all along, hidden underneath years of trying to be the man someone else needed me to be. I was 5'6", financially secure, physically strong, intellectually curious, and emotionally available. For the first time in decades, that felt like more than enough. It felt like everything I needed to be completely, authentically happy. As I drove toward town, passing the small resort where Catherine was staying while she worked on her novel, I realized that Uncle Raymond's greatest gift hadn't been the money or the property. It had been the freedom to finally become myself. The man Elisa had dismissed as half a man had turned out to be exactly the right size for the life he was meant to live.